And perhaps at another time we could go through some more details of some of the topics we'll touch upon, but at least to get some sort of general understanding of the area of halacha that we're talking about, and how Peil Mamish in reality, halacha lamaisa, this topic, how it comes down by the poskim and how we generally follow. The topic tonight is become very popular over the last quite a few years, and that is using suppositories on Yom Kippur, or fast days in general, especially for people who drink more than 1 cup of coffee a day, and they get this withdrawal for not taking coffee on Yom Kippur. And the question becomes whether they're allowed to take caffeine suppositories to somehow reduce the symptoms of the caffeine withdrawal. We'll discuss prior to Yom Kippur and on Yom Kippur. We'll discuss both aspects over here. So just to get a rough outline of the area of halacha that we're trying to tackle, there's a number of things that are interconnected over here. The first thing we really have to approach is, what is the nature of the issue or the isser of achila on Yom Kippur? The Torah tells us that on the 10th day, which is Yom Kippur, it says, "V'inisem es nafshei seichem," one has to afflict their soul. And from there, the Gemara derives that there's a prohibition to eat and drink on Yom Kippur. So what we have to explore a bit is, what's the nature of this prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur? And there are a number of different aspects that are not just true regarding Yom Kippur, but are true in any type of Isser Achila, any type of prohibition related to eating. There is a number of different areas that have to be explored. First of all, the nature of the food as being something that's royal achila, that has to be food that could be ingested or is considered edible. Food that is considered healthy individual food. People that are briim, are healthy individuals, eat the food, versus people who are unhealthy. For people, let's say, medication for the people who aren't healthy. Then you have what's considered the normal way of eating, which is known as derech achila, the normal way a person eats food, and the derech hano, the way a person benefits from food. And then we have the concept of the shir achila, how much food. So these are 4 subcategories or 4 areas that need to be explored when it comes to the nature of eating on Yom Kippur. As again, we're not going to get into all of them in depth because we don't have the time, but we'll at least hopefully touch upon some of them. The second area that we need to explore a little bit is more about the nature of a chayil on Yom Kippur. We know that someone who is sick on Yom Kippur in certain circumstances is permitted to eat on Yom Kippur. So we're going to have to distinguish between a chayil sheyesh bei sakana, a person who's in a life-threatening situation, versus a chayil she'ein bei sakana, a person who's not in a life-threatening situation. And then the third area I want to explore is the nature of the inui, the fact that the Torah uses the word inui, that you have to pain yourself or afflict pain on Yom Kippur. What does that mean? And here there's a number of topics that we need to explore. One of them is, are we talking about making sure we're in pain, or are we making sure that we don't get pleasure? The differentiation between not receiving pleasure or not doing pleasurable acts versus actually inflicting pain. When a person eats something that's less than the measurement, less than the shear, so essentially they're not eating perhaps, is that considered also part of the problem of inui or not? And then we have to discuss the nature of trying to lessen the inui of Yom Kippur by using certain substances to try to prevent the Yom Kippur experience or the fasting experience to be too harsh. Does that in any way violate the mitzvahs aseh of Yinisem es nafshei seichem? So just to use the obvious example, they have these tzum kal or tzom kal pills that you take before the fast, and officially it's supposed to help with hydration. I'm not sure exactly what it does, but somehow it's supposed to make the fasting easier. Does that in any way encroach upon and take away from the responsibility, the mitzvah of Inui Nafshi Seichem, that you should be in a state of pain. Does that sort of take away from that? So those are the main three categories that I want to explore tonight. I may not go in order, and I'm not going to go through every single one at length because there's so much to talk about, but at least to get some of the basic discussion points with halacha, lemaisa, that when it comes to these areas. So let's start a little bit from the beginning. The Torah tells us in Parshas Emor, Ach ba'asar lachodesh hashvi hazeh yom haKippurim hu, that on the 10th day of the 7th month, it's Yom Kippur, Mikra Kodesh, it's a day of holiness, Mikra Kodesh yilachem, v'inisem es nafshei seichem, and you should afflict pain on your soul. And then the next pasuk says, Ki chol hanefesh ar lo sheloi su'una betzem mazeh v'nichrasa ma'amel. If a person does not afflict pain on Yom Kippur, so then they get kares. Shabbos Shabbos and hulachem v'inisem es nafshei seichem b'tisha l'chodesh. From the 9th day of the month, you should afflict pain. Those are the three verses that the Torah speaks about this in Parshas Emor. Now, the Gemara in Yuma, when it discusses this word inoi, the Gemara is trying to make sense of what that word means. What exactly is the Torah telling us? The Torah doesn't give us a defined criteria as to what you should or shouldn't do on Yom Kippur. It just says, v'yinisem es nafshei seichem. What does that include? What does that exclude? So we're familiar with the 5 lavin of Yom Kippur, the 5 prohibitions on Yom Kippur, which are eating, drinking, bathing, putting cream on your hand, and marital relations. Those are the 5 prohibitions. And leather shoes, right? Eating and drinking is one, and not wearing shoes on Yom Kippur. Those are the 5 isurim on Yom Kippur. There is a debate in the Rishonim as to whether or not they all have equal status. Everybody agrees that eating and drinking is for sure included in the prohibition, biblically. The other 3, such as bathing, let's say, may be less of a biblical prohibition and maybe a rabbinic, on some level, rabbanon. That's the opinion of the Rosh and Tosfos, and it does play a major nafkamin la halacha. Just to use an example, someone who's not well but is not in severe illness, are they allowed to bathe on Yom Kippur to just relieve some of the pain? So a lot of poskim will say yes, because the prohibition of bathing is less of a prohibition than eating and drinking. So that's sort of the idea when it comes to eating and drinking. That's where we have this idea from. Now, how do we know from the word inoi? So the Gemara finds psukim in the Torah that I could learn out from, as the Gemara wants to do, to find sources to prove that afflicting pain means not eating and drinking. Now, the Gemara defines this in a very specific way. And the Gemara says that the shear, the amount of food that one would need to eat and consume on Yom Kippur in order to be in violation of the inoi is a kaiseves hagasa. What's a kaiseves hagasa? A kaiseves hagasa is roughly the size of one of those large eggs. That's the way, according to some opinions, hold. It's a fig. That's what it literally means. It's a fig. But the size of it and the measurements of it is a big debate, how we measure these things nowadays. We're not going to get into measurements. If a person has a practical shayla halacha lemaisa, when it comes to someone who isn't well and needs to eat on Yom Kippur, we could discuss the practical halacha. But that's the measurement. Now, this measurement differs from usual measurements when it comes to the prohibition of eating. So, for example, you're not allowed to eat chaylev. You're not allowed to eat non-kosher fat or pork. The measurement min haTorah to be in violation of eating pork is a kazayis. A kazayis is at least a half, if not a third, of the size of an egg, of a kaiseves hagasa. So it's much less of a shear. On Yom Kippur, the shear is much larger. Now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, because you would think on Yom Kippur, when we have the prohibition of v'yinisem es nafshei seichem, you should think the lesser shear should be the shear, the measurement that should be the prohibition. But the logic the Gemara says is that when it comes to Yom Kippur, it's not so much about eating. It's about making sure that you don't encroach or infringe on the v'yinis nafshei seichem, which essentially means that a person has to make sure that he doesn't have his lisyuve daite, the person's mind shouldn't be in rest. Usually when you eat, so you just feel more calm. Your body feels calm. You feel at peace. When you're hungry, we all know, we don't feel relaxed. We don't feel settled. So the lack of eating is the measurement of food that's required to have l'suyui daite, to restore oneself, to regulate oneself, to create an equilibrium, would be a large amount of a keseves hagasa. So that means if you eat less than that amount, you're not in violation on a biblical level. You don't get chorus on a biblical level. There's still an additional issue, which is chetzi shir. That means in Torah, we paskin that even if it's not that amount, even if it's less than that amount, even a half of that amount, even a drop of that amount, it's still a prohibition in Torah, because chetzi shir also in Torah. But to get chorus, the shir is keseves hagasa. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch remarks, based on this idea, that he says that there is a distinction, therefore, when it comes to the Isser of eating on Yom Kippur, to the Isser of eating, let's say, non-kosher food. He says when it comes to the Isser of Yom Kippur, it's tied and connected to the idea of Inui, that a person has to make sure to prevent or to make sure that they don't go out of that state of Inui. Now, let's ask the question, what type of food does that include? In other words, like this. Do we now say that the laws of eating on Yom Kippur shift drastically from all the other laws when it comes to not eating kosher food versus non-kosher food? Or do they still have the same laws? So for example, what if I eat something that tastes bitter? So if I eat something that tastes bitter, am I in violation of eating? Is it considered food? Did I eat? Do I say in Yom Kippur that's not the qualification, it's not about eating or not eating? Do I say the qualification is whether there is Inui or not Inui, so maybe even if it's bitter food, I'm still in violation? What if I eat, but I don't eat in the normal way? I don't eat it through my throat. Or I don't eat food, I eat pills. So I'm not eating in the conventional way. It's not achila in the normal way. It's not derech achila, shaloika derech achila. It's not in the normal way. But do we say in Yom Kippur, the rules of the game change? And therefore, in that sense, you're still in violation if you won't have the inui that we're requiring. So every single one of these things are really debate and halacha, and we don't, as we said, have the time to go through every single one, everybody's opinions and how it generally is brought out. But just to bring out some of the points. So generally, when it comes to food which is royal achila or not royal achila, so we paskin if the food is not royal achila klal, it's not something which is edible at all. So on a biblical level, min haTorah, you're not in violation. You didn't violate anything because it's not considered food. At the end of the day, the laws of what's considered food still apply to Yom Kippur. You're not in violation. However, on a rabbinic level, the Rabbanon, you're still in violation if you have something that's not considered food. That means even if it's not royal achila klal, you could still be considered in violation of eating on Yom Kippur on a Rabbanon level. Because there is, on some level, perhaps some nutrition, some nourishment, something you're getting from it, which is a problem with the Rabbanon. In that itself, we have to differentiate between regular food and food that is designated and set aside for people who aren't healthy, like medication, where the food is designed for people who are not well. So then one would argue that perhaps there also the laws change, because we know, let's say, when it comes to bachalas asuris, when it comes to things which are not kosher, if it's meant as a medication, so then if it's only a rabbinic issue, it's not royal achil, it's not meant for food, then there's no violation. So, for example, if a person needs to take a pill that it's not kosher, and he needs it for refuah, and he can't find the kosher pill, so then he's allowed to swallow that pill. It's not food. It may provide the body with some, medication, but it's not considered food. It's not royal achila. And in that sense, he would be allowed to use it if need be. When it comes to Yom Kippur, the question is that true or not true? Do we apply that same rule? So here we have a very big debate. The Shagas Arya, the great Gon, the Shagas Arya, writes that he thinks that on Yom Kippur, it's asur. He thinks that even if it's done for medicinal purposes, he thinks it's prohibited, based on the principle called achshevei, which means that when you eat it, you are making it food like any other food. And there's such a concept when it comes to Pesach, that when you ingest food, eat food, even if it's not really edible, it's not considered food, but by you eating it, you give it a status of food. It's called achshaveh. In that sense, he wants to argue by Yom Kippur, even for a refuah, we apply the rule of achshaveh, and therefore it could be it's not edible. And even if it's not in the normal way of eating, such as swallowing pills, he would say it's a problem. Based on the Shagas Arya, basically any form of medication would be problematic to use on Yom Kippur. However, many disagree with the Shagas Arya, and they say no, that on Yom Kippur we don't apply this principle and say achshaveh, and say that if it's doing for refuah, it's problematic. And we say that if it's something which inherently is not food, especially if you're not eating it in the normal way, then you would be allowed to take it in certain circumstances. You would be allowed to take it in certain circumstances. So, for example, and again, I'm sort of cutting to the chase, getting to the end of the conversation. If a person, let's say, takes a daily pill, let's say they have a blood pressure pill, blood pressure medication. Now, blood pressure, if you don't take your pill, it could be dangerous. But let's say you're going to miss it one day, it's not going to cause too much havoc on your system. But here, halacha will say that you would be allowed to take it on Yom Kippur. You would be allowed to take your blood pressure medication. Taking, let's say, for example, if a person has minor things that they use certain pills for, a diabetic for sure, would be a hay fever, allergies, a severe headache, migraines. So if a person is in that state where they're in pain and they're having a lot of discomfort, so then the poskim will say they're allowed to take those pills based on the majority of view, the Ksaf Sofer and other poskim that don't agree with the Shagas Arya, they would say you're allowed to take those pills on Yom Kippur. What's the reason? The reason is because they're arguing it's not the way of eating. It's not royal achil, it's not considered fit for consumption. And in that way, and you're doing it for refuah purposes, so in that case, they will say it's okay. Now, the truth is we have to explore an important detail about this because there is a bigger discussion to be had. The question revolves around the Gemara in Chulin. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish have a debate. When a person is eating something, at what point is the person considered to have eaten something? So let's say, for example, a person ate matzah on Pesach, they swallowed it, and then they regurgitated it or they threw it up. Did they eat it or not? If a person ate chaylev, not kosher food, and they had it swallowed, they swallowed it or chewed it, and then it came up. Are they in violation or not? So Rabbi Yochanan holds that when it comes to macholim, foods, the nature of achila is hanos hagoren, or hanos hachech. The throat has to have pleasure. If the throat doesn't have pleasure, it's not considered eating. That means if you put, let's say, a G-tube in a person straight into their stomach, and they're getting nutrition that way, or an IV, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not considered like you ate. You didn't eat. Reish Lakish disagrees, and Reish Lakish holds that hanos b'nei me'ov, or b'nei ma'ayim. What you need is that the intestines, we know the food goes through the stomach and into the larger intestines and all that, and that breaks apart the food and it gives you the nutrition and all that. So according to Reish Lakish, that's considered eating. This is a huge machlekes in many years of halacha. We paskin generally like Rabbi Yochanan, that hanos hagorin is what makes the difference. So, for example, if a person, let's say, ate matzah on Pesach and they threw it up, so based on this, you wouldn't have to eat more matzah. You satisfied your obligation. You already yotzu your mitzvah of eating matzah. If a person, let's say, ate chaylev and spit it up, they still violated eating chaylev because they had the food go into their system through the throat. It was hanos hagorin. The question is, when it comes to Yom Kippur, do we apply the same rules or not? So here you have a massive debate amongst the Achreinim. The question is, do I say that perhaps on Yom Kippur, because the nature of the eating, as we said before, is different, where the nature of the eating is more about inui versus not inui, so then we're not necessarily looking for the normal general standard criteria of eating, which is through the throat. Perhaps any type of nourishment, any type of nutrition that goes through our system would be considered eating on Yom Kippur. That means even hanas b'nei me'ov, even just if the intestines received food, that's also considered a violation of eating. So this became a huge debate. The Chassam Sofer is of the opinion that on Yom Kippur, all that's required is hanos b'nei mayim. That means that if you have an IV on Yom Kippur, you're in violation of eating on Yom Kippur, of infringing on and violating a violation of Leis Una. The positive side, according to him, is let's say you took a candy or a lolly and you sucked it and then spit it out. You didn't violate the Yom Kippur because it never went through into your Bnei Ma'ayim. You only had pleasure in the throat, not in the stomach, not in the intestines. So there's a chumra and a kula, according to the Chassam Sofer. The Minchas Chinuch wants to argue like the Chassam Sofer a little bit, but then at the end, he thinks that maybe you need both. Unlike Rabbi Yochanan that holds you need only one, he thinks on Yom Kippur you need both. You need to have pleasure of the throat and pleasure of the intestines. The Or Sameach thinks you only need pleasure of the throat. It's just like any other, and he brings a raya. The Gemara says that if a person ate in Yom Kippur, they put something in their mouth and they choked and died, so that means the food got stuck here, they still violated Yom Kippur and they didn't get kapara. What do you see from that Gemara seemingly? That even if you just ate and the food didn't go to the intestines, you're still in violation. That's one of the Or Sameach's rayas. Highly questionable. The Achiezer questions and challenges his raya, but the Achiezer essentially wants to say that if it does not enter the throat, there's no eating. He says in order to be in violation, you have to have it enter the throat. And the reason why the Achiezer got involved in this is because someone asked the Achiezer a question. The Achiezer was asked, the doctors were asking whether they could put into the person through like a suppository, through the rectum, certain types of medication, food and drink, and whether or not you're in violation of eating on Yom Kippur. And he goes through this whole debate. This is in Chelek Gimel Siman Samach Aleph. And he wants to argue at the end that since it doesn't go through the throat, you're not in violation. He thinks there's no problem, seemingly, at least for a chayla, to have something in the system but not go through the throat. That's what he argues. The Eglei Tal, the Sachat Shaver, also thinks you need to have both. You need to have the throat and the Bnei Ma'ayim. And likewise, the Chalkas Yaakov says that, and that seems to be the general consensus of most poskim. Now, if we just put this together, and without getting into all the lumdus, obviously, we're just giving, so to speak, the upshot of this discussion, will come out like this. The question that was asked to the poskim, like the Achiezer, like the Chalkas Yaakov, was whether a doctor, a sick person, a person who wasn't well, whether or not are they allowed to have an IV, or are they allowed to have some sort of fluids or substances going through their body without going into the throat? And they poskened absolutely yes. However, what if you're a healthy being? You're a healthy person. And you just want to be hooked up to an IV because you don't want to feel the faint of Yom Kippur. Are you allowed to do it? The Achiezer uses a language, Einei Nikra Achila Klal. He doesn't think it's considered eating at all. Is he really going to say that a person's allowed to be hooked up to an IV, so everybody's going to walk into shul with an IV in their arms? Is that what he's trying to say? Or is he saying for a sick person, a chayla, he feels like there's more than enough reason to say it's okay? It makes sense, al pi svara, to say that he won't, even though he's learning, he thinks the Chassam Sofer will agree with him, but it'll be difficult to say that we ignore the Chassam Sofer and ignore his rayas to say that any healthy person, as long as they're not taking the food through their mouth, is allowed to do it. Now, even when you take food through your mouth, there's a distinction between food that you're chewing, where you could argue there's hanos hagarden, where the throat is having pleasure, versus swallowing a pill. Swallowing a pill, almost according to all opinions, is not considered derech achil. It's not considered a normal way of eating. The Achiezer may argue that taking a pill is still considered derech achila on Yom Kippur because it's going through the throat, even if though there's no pleasure in the throat. So there may be a distinction, according to the Achiezer, about swallowing pills. But even if we would take the Achiezer's argument and say that for a sick person, they're allowed to go with an IV or take suppositories or whatever, that may be the case. For a healthy person, you would seemingly have to be choishish, have to be worried for the Chassam Sofer's opinion. Now, when you look... Right, we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're talking about that in a minute. Now, there was an interesting discussion that the Poskim dealt with, and that is, we know the din on Yom Kippur is that the Mishnah says that if a person needs to eat, so we say that we try to give them the lesser of the Isurim first. So we try to do hakal. We do the lesser of the Isur. So if, let's say, for example, the Gemara says, let's say you have an Isur Nevela and an Isur Tevel. So Nevela is lesser of an Isur than Tevel, let's say. So there's a hierarchy of levels of Isurim. So we try to give the lesser amount or the lesser Isur. So here the Poskim are asked the question, what happens if someone needs to eat on Yom Kippur based on the argument of the Achiezer? And there's many others. We saw the Chalkas Yaakov, the Chalkas Yoyev, the Marsham, on and on and on, that seem to say that it's okay. Maybe if someone is not healthy on Yom Kippur, needs to eat, maybe we should just stick them in with an IV. Or maybe we should give them some sort of suppository. In that way, you're doing the lesser of the Isser, instead of giving them food directly through the mouth. So there are some poskim who suggest that maybe that should be the case. But most poskim don't think that way. Most poskim say once the Torah gives you permission to eat, you don't have to, in this case, that's not called eating. Since it's not called eating, and the Torah says you're allowed to eat, so you're allowed to eat. Maybe in what you're eating, you should definitely be more, you shouldn't take the biggest isser. That's why we try to do shiurim first. That means we start off with the smallest amount that the person can handle, less than the shiur of a kesev sagasa. In a time period, you space it out for, let's say, 9 minutes or whatever it is. But in terms of eating, the Torah says you can eat. If you're allowed to eat, you can eat. You don't have to do something that's not eating. That's sort of the argument. That's the way people like the Tzitz Eliezer argues, and the Shevet Halevi. That's the way poskim argue.
Could you say that perhaps the Torah was talking about a time they didn't have other methods?
Okay, but then we could throw out half of halacha then also, because we derive a lot of principles from the Lashonis. We believe that the Torah was given in a nitzchiistic way, from a perspective of eternity. That's the case. He uses the word achila. Chazal say you're allowed to eat. You're allowed to eat. So that's a big discussion, and that is one of the major nafkaminas regarding this whole machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Now, the question is, when you have, let's say, an IV, is whether or not you're getting either b'nei hanos hamaya, b'nei ma'ayav, either. Are you really having any food go through your system in any way? Is it really being digested in your system, or just being absorbed through the blood, through the body, without going through the system? So this already, the poskim already discussed. They spoke to doctors, and they got, the doctors' opinions on it. And it's an interesting, you see the progression between what they were told in earlier times to later times. You can look in the Nishmas Avram, who brings down the different discussions on this topic, but it seems like some doctors suggested that there was some sort of absorption inside the B'nai Ma'ayim, that it does go through the intestines a little bit. It could produce waste and therefore must go through the intestines a little bit. Others argued that it doesn't. It just, the body absorbs it within the bloodstream, and therefore it's not going at all into the B'nai Ma'ayim in that regard. In my humble opinion, I don't know if necessarily the criteria of B'nai Ma'ayin has to mean literally that the B'nai Ma'ayin is getting benefit, or there's Hanos Haguf, the body gets benefit. And I'll tell you why. If you look in Shulchan Aruch Harav, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe uses a very interesting language. The Alter Rebbe says, the halacha says, if let's say someone eats an achila gasa on Yom Kippur. What's an achila gasa? So you ate gesund on Erev Yom Kippur, and now it's time to stop. It's shkia, and we take in a little earlier. So let's say before, let's say Shkia comes and you're stuffed. You ate your Sudas HaMafsekes was full and you're full. And then you decided, just for the heck of it, you're gonna eat another, potato. And it's already past the Zman, so you're already in the Zman of the fast. Are you overeating on Yom Kippur? So the way the Alter Rebbe puts it, it's not the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, but the way the Alter Rebbe puts it, he says, it depends what the food is. If it's something that damages your body, so then not only are you not in violation, but in a way you're fulfilling the Inu Yisna Sheisechem, because you're causing pain to yourself. Cuts b'mezayna could be, yes. But he says it's mazekas leguf. If it's mazekas leguf, that's the inui. But he says something which is like a dessert, something sweet. He says there's always space for the dessert, as the Gemara says. So then you'll be over because you did have hanos haguf. Now, what type of hanos haguf? The b'nei ma'ayim is full. You can't really say that the intestines are getting hana. The b'nei ma'ayim, you just finished eating, you're stuffed. But the guf feels good about it. There's a certain hanos haguf that the guf has. Whatever it is, the sweet foods gives you a sugar rush, whatever you want to explain it based on our understanding of physiology and biology, well, not biology, whatever, but the way the chemicals are, affecting our brain or whatever it is, you feel good. Contrast is the Alter Rebbe, let's say smells. Are you allowed to smell something on Yom Kippur? Now, we know we make a bracha when we smell something, and the reason why we make a bracha is because officially there is some hana. It's a birchas hanenin. But the Alter Rebbe says by regarding Yom Kippur, you're allowed to smell. That's why there's a big Indian to have tabak or whatever, because of the fact that you're supposed to make meya brachas and all that. But he says since there's no hanos haguf klau, it's only hanos hanefesh. So then he says that you're not chayv. That means there's nothing chemically happening there's no biochemical reaction in the body that should be. Okay, we know that the olfactory bulb gets affected. Obviously, there are chemicals that are affecting through smell, but at least in halachic terms, there isn't any chemical reaction. In that sense, there's no hanos haguf. So from that criteria, the way the Alter Rebbe words it, there's mokum to say that we don't have to have literally hanos b'nei ma'ayim in that sense. It means any time there's going to be hanos haguf, where it's going to remove the inui, that will be either biblical or rabbinic prohibition on Yom Kippur. That's Lanias Daiti. I can't say this as definitive. I'm saying this is my understanding of the Alter Rebbe. If that's the case, then a healthy person taking an IV would definitely be infringing on the Ina issue. I think on that level, you're definitely, if you don't need it and you could survive without it, it shouldn't be done. Generally speaking, talking about a chayla for a second, a person who's a chayla, so if a person is in a life-threatening situation, so then you're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. L'chatchila, we try to do shiurim, as we said. So for example, if a person feels faint, and feels like they need to eat, so we try to give them, let's say, at first a little bit of water, and if that's not enough, give them more. A person shouldn't decide for the person who they're giving to how much they should have. If they say they need more, you give them. You don't become a doctor for them. Unless you're a professional, you don't decide. You have to be on. Reb Chaim Brisker said he's machmer b'koach nefesh on saving people's lives, right? He's not lenient, because the question was his opinion when it came to Shabbos, violating Shabbos for a sick person. So people thought that he's lenient on Chilul Shabbos. He says, I'm not lenient on Chilul Shabbos. I'm machmer and b'koach nefashos. So we have to be careful. Sometimes we see someone else, our children or whatever, like, yeah, maybe you could put. If they say they need to eat, you give it to them or let them take it themselves. But generally, there is a concept of shiurim. But this is only a person who is either we know is in a life-threatening situation or could lead to a life-threatening situation. If it's something that we know is not a life-threatening situation, like a person who has a bad headache or things like that, we won't say eat. We don't give them permission to eat. There is a debate whether or not, as we said before, whether or not we could give a chayla she'ein bei sakana medication, where it's not food, it's not really royal achila. And especially if you're going to say it's going through the mouth, but it's not derech achila because you're swallowing it, whether that's permitted on Yom Kippur or not. Most poskim say yes, as we said before, but there is a suggestion that instead of taking it in a regular way, for sure not with water, unless you really can't swallow it and you need it, you can take it with water, but make the water bitter. So it's again not roilach, it's not considered drinkable. But there is a suggestion to wrap it in a little paper and swallow it that way, and that way you for sure are not doing it derech achila. We don't have time to get into the reasons for that, but that's a suggestion given. So what we see from that is that even a person who is somewhat of a chayla, especially if he has migraines, there the pasuk say take Tylenol, Advil, whatever, that's for sure mutter, that if it's not normal food and it's not done the normal way, there is a heter. Based on that, if a person has severe caffeine withdrawals, I think l'chol ha'adayis, not l'chol ha'adayis, because we said the Shagasari, others in the Chassam Sofer may disagree, but the way we would paskin will be okay to use the suppository. Or if a person, let's say, knows that they have severe caffeine withdrawals, that they're going to be sick and have severe headaches, although the caffeine withdrawals don't help with migraines officially, but if they know that the symptoms are going to be so overwhelming that they're going to be nafal and mishkav, they're going to have to lie in bed, so then to take such a suppository, Lania's daiti, in my humble opinion, is that would be permitted. But what about a healthy person who just doesn't want to have to, who doesn't want the withdrawals, right? They just want to have an easier Yom Kippur, so to speak, right? Are they allowed to take these suppositories or not? So based on what we said till now, I think there's a big question whether or not, or whether you could or can't. I would say it wouldn't be preferable. But let me add one more detail to the mix. And that is the question about the nature of inui. So as we started off with, the Gemara tells us, how do we know you're not allowed to eat and drink on Yom Kippur? Because it says, v'nisim es nafshi seichem. And we learn it out from the word inui, what's considered inui. Now we have in two different Gemaras, it describes the concept of inui. In the Gemara in Yuma, in the Gemara in Nedarim. In the Gemara in Nedarim is discussing a neder, a vow that a woman made. The halacha is, a husband is allowed to annul his wife's nedarim if it's dvarim shebeinoi lebeino, matters that affect their personal relationship, or it's something which is causing a lot of pain. What the criteria of that is, that's a discussion in the Gemara. The Gemara there discusses, what if a woman made a neder, I'm not going to bathe, I'm not going to take a shower. Is that considered dvarim hametztairim? Is that considered inui? Is it dvarim shebeinoi lebeino? And the Gemara suggests, yeah, if a woman says that she's not going to bathe, it's a matter of inui. The same thing if a woman says she's not going to eat, or she's not going to eat certain foods. It's a concept of inui. However, the poskim differentiate, and we don't have time to get into the full breadth of the discussion, they differentiate between the concept of inui Yom Kippur and the concept of inui by nedarim. And they say like this, by the inui of nedarim, the whole objective is to create pain. That's the concept of the inui there. The woman wants to, or let's say a man in certain cases, wants to afflict pain on themselves. So by afflicting, how are they going to afflict pain? By not bathing, by not eating. Say a person is anorexic, they're not necessarily thinking of causing themselves pain. That's a different issue. But there are people that, tinus v'sigufim, they want to afflict pain. So the objective is to feel tsar. Yom Kippur, the objective is not to feel tsar. The objective is not to have tainug, not to have pleasure. If that's the case, so then if a person is in a real tsar, a person is in real pain, and he takes something to alleviate the pain, he may not be in violation of the Nisim es nafshi seichem, because the nature of the inui is not about pain. It's about not being in a state of suyuvidaita, having pleasure, having hana. Another area where this halachic differentiation comes out is really between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. So a topic I wrote about 14 years ago was about wearing Crocs or wearing comfortable, shoes that are not leather on Yom Kippur. On Tisha B'Av, I argued it'll be prohibited because on Tisha B'Av it's about being in pain. It's about mourning and being in pain. Although you could argue that an oval who has to be in a state of avelus what's that boundary? What's the border between pain and just not having pleasure? But on Yom Kippur, it's more than just regular avelus. There is an added level of avelus. So therefore, there is a concept of tsar. What? On Tisha B'Av, I'm sorry. Versus Yom Kippur, I think you are allowed to wear those shoes. The Chazal gave you a definition of leather. That's considered, whatever the reasons are, we're not going to get into it. So you would not be allowed to wear leather shoes, but if you have a very comfortable shoe, it's not, halach will say it's not considered tainuk. If it's not considered tainuk, then you'll be allowed to wear it on Yom Kippur. So that's just another area of where this distinction comes out. Because in those days, the other option was wearing wood. They didn't have much. The Rishonim talk about this, about wearing material shoes. The Ran talks about this. Other Rishonim talk about it. I could send you my article I wrote if you want to look this in more. But I'm just using this as another example of the Geder of Inu Yom Kippur, differentiating between pain and tainug and that boundary. So again, based on that, if a person is in a state of real pain, you're not in violation of Lo Su'una, because this is not, that's not the objective, is to be in pain. But a healthy individual who just wants to ease the fast, so to speak, in that sense, they want to have, maybe they're infringing on tainug, the extreme of tainug. And in that case, I would have reason to argue that they shouldn't. And to add one more detail to this, the poskim discussed, they were asked a question about these som cow pills, as we mentioned before, taking a pill to make the fast easier. Rabbi Feinstein was asked the question, and the way the question was presented to him, the way the question was presented to him is someone who, let's say, is not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. Is there any reason for him to take these pills before Yom Kippur to enable him to maybe fast? And he argued that there is no chiyuv, that you have to take these pills or these supplements before Yom Kippur to make the fast easier so you don't have to eat on Yom Kippur. Because he says there are two different things. When Yom Kippur comes and he's feeling this way, you don't have to prevent it. But then he says that there may be even an isser b'davar. He says perhaps it's prohibited to take these, and he wants to argue because of the fact, putting in an IV, he says is chabala. You're not allowed to cause yourself pain. You're not allowed to be chayvul. You're not allowed to injure yourself, wound yourself, creating a wound. So that's one issue. But even taking, let's say, these pills or whatever, he'll argue that that may actually be against the nature of what Yom Kippur is supposed to be. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in the Menucha Shloima argues very strongly. He says someone who takes these making the fast easy pills, he says he's a novel b'shus HaTorah. He says very strongly that it's forbidden, except for a chayla. That's the exception. But he says a healthy person who says is a novel b'shus HaTorah. There's other poskim who say you could take it. The Chalkas Yaakov says you could take it. The Tzitz Eliezer thinks you could take them. But you definitely have now Gedolei Hadar, Gedolei HaPoskim, like Rabbi Feinstein, like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. There's a few others that I'm not recalling right now who say that you shouldn't take them.
But hang on, we eat before the fast day.
Oh, very good. So that's the next point I want to get to. The next point I wanted to get to, we'll finish with this. Why do we eat before we on the 9th day? So there's 4 reasons brought in the Rishonim. One reason is, like Rashi says, to make the fast easier. But it's not the reason of the Rambam, and it's not the reason of the Ravya. It's not the reason of most Rishonim. The argument is made that since you have to be choishish, you have to be concerned for the other reasons as well. So in the words of Rabbi Feinstein, granted, there may be an element of eating on Erev Yom Kippur as part of the, right, we say if you eat on Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur is as if you fasted 2 days. There is that element. Some say it's to create a differentiation between fasting and eating. According to the Rambam, it's to differentiate. So then if you're going to take a tzum kal pill, you're not showing a differentiation really, because you're saying essentially it's all to go in. There's a lot of lumdas here. We don't have the time. But Ramosha says, let us say Rashi's reason, but Rashi is not saying this as that is the only reason. Rashi is suggesting a reason that is part of many other reasons. We still have to be choishish. We still have to be worried about the other reasons. if you argue Moshe Feinstein's status, which seems to be Rav Shlomo Zalman's argument, and is an argument that's brought by others, if that's the case, you look at the Sdei Chemet who talks about this, if that's the case, there would be grounds to say, like I said, that you should not be taking these things. If you can't take it Erev Yom Kippur, definitely not taking it on Yom Kippur. And especially with the language of Rav Shlomo Zalman, your novel B'Shus HaTorah. But where I have a Dayan Tzorech Iyun is that in the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe talks about it, fasting on eating on Erev Yom Kippur, he only brings the reason of Rashi. He only says, and he says clearly the reason is in order to make the fasting easier. So perhaps, if you're medayik that way from the Alter Rebbe, then maybe yesh loymar that we don't say that way. And we say like the others who hold, like the Tzitz Eliezer says, and the Chalkas Yaakov says that you are allowed to take these pills on Erev Yom Kippur. If that's the case, what about on Yom Kippur itself? In other words, do we say to lighten the load is only if you do it prior to Yom Kippur, but on Yom Kippur, when the Isser of the Inui already starts, now to do something to lessen the Inui may be prohibited, may be problematic. It means even if you learn like the Alter Rebbe, you wouldn't take it as so far as to say that it will also continue even on Yom Kippur itself, to say you could take it. So just to come to a conclusion, and there's a lot we didn't discuss, but I tried to give you the Rashi Prokim, the basic outline of the discussion. Lanias daiti, if a person is unwell or a person is going to have severe withdrawals on Yom Kippur from a lack of not taking caffeine, taking the suppository will be fine, either before or on Yom Kippur. If the person is doing it, they don't have terrible withdrawals, but they're someone who, it'll just be, right? It'll be easier because they do have, everybody who's used to taking caffeine every day, all of a sudden you don't take it one day, have some discomfort. I would say that is part of the Inui. And part of the Inui is to have that discomfort. So you added it to yourself. So like that's what the Alter Rebbe says about eating the Achila Gasa, that's the Inui. So in that sense, I would have a harder time telling someone that they could take those suppositories in that case. But when it comes to a person who's a chayla, taking pills, taking all these things, we pass on like the majority of opinions, you're allowed to take it. If you can't sleep, let's say you want to take a sleeping pill, and you're a person who has insomnia, you'd also be allowed to take a sleeping pill. But if it's just the case, you want to get up early and you want to fall asleep early, so you get up early, I don't think you should take a sleeping pill then either. But again, a person who falls onto some category of a chayla, not any category of chayla, because you have levels on Shabbos, so follow the same lines of Shabbos, then you have, if a person has severe headaches, you could take Tylenol Advil, that would be, so to speak, at least Lanias Daiti, my understanding. All right, Yeshua.